I came across the disappearance of Bobby Panknin, who was 4 years old at the time when he disappeared from Deep Lake in the northeast of Washington on the 3rd of August 1963. At the time, Bobby was on a family camping trip at this place, and on that day, his mother had taken him and his two brothers, 6 and 10, on a short hike that didn't stray too far from the campsite. It's not completely clear what happened on this hike, but Bobby somehow managed to get separated from his mother and brothers. 2 days into the search effort, authorities had absolutely no idea what could have possibly happened in this incident. A Spokane boy was the object of a widespread search Monday in the rugged countryside near here. Searchers probed the waters of Deep Lake searching for the boy who was reported missing Saturday. There is absolutely no clue to his disappearance, Stevens County Sheriff A.E. Halter said. Bloodhounds have failed to turn up the Tots trail. At the time of his disappearance, there was nothing untoward that seemed to take place. The family never heard Bobby shout or anything like that, and there was no evidence to suggest that an animal was responsible, which we'll get more into in a moment. First, something odd. The 5th day of searching failed to turn up any trace of Bobby. The Spokane boy was barefoot and wearing a swimsuit at the time. Hopes were raised earlier Wednesday with the discovery of a youngster's footprint. A bloodhound from Seattle found the print. The 80-pound animal named Caesar was unable to uncover any trail. This footprint was assumed and treated to have been left behind by Bobby. It seems to have been a singular print with no others surrounding it, which was odd, and by that same token, seemed to have been alone. It's important to note too that where the print was found was off the beaten track, and searchers were armed with power tools to help them make their way through all the long tangles of this area. It seems that after the dog failed to pick up any further trace after this print was left, hope began to drain from the situation, and Sheriff Halter basically went on to say that he had no ideas left in how to deal with this. In the face of diminishing hope, the search goes on and will continue to at least Sunday. We're nearing the point of desperation. We don't know where to look next or what approach to use, the sheriff said in describing the search. The sheriff went on to say that the search area had already been widened and many more members brought in. But the area was so rugged that it was just unbelievable that little Bobby could have gotten too far away on foot, alone. Now, this is where people began to blame bears or another animal again, and it seems that the sheriff and search leaders already knew that this wasn't the case because it had been explored once, but to put it to bed. Some search detachments with bear hunting dogs went into the hills yesterday. Halter said the move should prove or disprove speculation that some sort of wild animal might have taken him. These efforts provided no evidence whatsoever that a bear was even in this area. It was also noted that if this had been the result of an animal, it would be highly likely that the family would have heard the event take place. Now, the sheriff said something interesting. Instead of disappearing on foot, the sheriff begins to contemplate a disappearance from above. I could go along with the possibility that he could have been taken by an eagle, but it's difficult to accept the boy's disappearance by either a bear or a cougar, said the sheriff. That's the first time I think I've ever seen the search leaders blame an eagle or being taken from above. But when you examine the details, you can begin to see why. Bobby disappeared right under everyone's noses. There was no sound or anything to suggest something was awry. For that reason, it becomes difficult to make the case that someone took him. Animal predation would have been obvious, as very clear, unmistakable, and frankly horrible evidence of that kind is left behind, which was never found. That leaves the sheriff at the eagle. But even with that, I'm almost certain you'd have heard that go down, and a shout or something like that from Bobby, but none of that ever happened. These were the final words on the incident. A day-long search by more than 200 persons failed yesterday to find a trace of Bobby, and authorities reluctantly announced that the official search is over. No trace of Bobby was found in a week of searching. "It's all over now," announced Sheriff Halter. "Anyone who wants to can come up and look, but the official search is over." This is one of those rare incidents in which not only was Bobby, or even a hint of him, ever found, but the authorities and the searchers alike had absolutely no idea what took place that day. They seemed to rule out everything, which only served to make the incident all the more confusing. It seems that the lone footprint only served to make it worse in that regard, because the dogs weren't able to follow it anywhere. Perhaps that was another reason that led the sheriff to the remarks about going up with an eagle. Whatever the case may be, I can't imagine that we'll ever know now. And that's also the end of the paper trail, so let's move on to the next disappearance. On the 5th of June in 2011, something unusual would happen on Mount Stirling, located in the Victorian Alpine National Park. On that particular day, a well-known and well-respected man by the name of David Prideaux, who was the head of the Bowen Correctional Facility. At this point in his life, David did have a history of having to manage high blood pressure, which he was taking medication for, but aside from that, he was said to be in generally good health. David had many skills and passions, including hunting and being in the outdoors, which he partook in a lot over the years. The day before he vanished on this mountain, he left his home to meet his brother-in-law in Mansfield, where they would finalise plans for their trip. The idea was to spend several days together hunting deer, and they chose Tomahawk Hut, which is near a ski area on Mount Stirling. It's important to note that while David was incredibly skilled and knowledgeable about the outdoors and in wilderness areas, this isn't a place that he was familiar with, and from what I can tell, may have been his first time at this location. In any case, they arrived at the hut around midday on the 4th, and they scouted the area together, looking for various places in which they could set up. After they found a couple of places that they were happy with, the pair went back to the hut and slept until the following morning. This now would be the day that David came to disappear. On the morning of the 5th of June, the pair set off at 7:45 AM to commence hunting, wearing thermals, camouflage clothing, and carrying backpacks. That included small thermos of coffee and a number of energy bars. Both carried a UHF radio, and David also carried a GPS navigation device, but no map on the area. He did not take his mobile phone, which was left in his vehicle at the campsite. After walking in a northerly direction for some time, they followed their plan to separate. For safety reasons, the brother-in-law went down a valley moving to the right, while David went up a knoll in the northwesterly direction. This was the last known sighting of David. It's understandable at a glance why David may have left his phone behind. He probably wasn't expecting to have any signal. However, I would never advise doing that, because in such an instance that you do happen to get lost, it may be crucial in being found. Sometimes you might find a pocket in which there is a signal, even if it's weak and intermittent, and in that case, if the signal wasn't stable, you could change your voicemail to declare that you're lost and try to explain where exactly. To go along with that, you could also use the What 3 Words app, and no, that's not a sponsor, but this is an app that gives every 3 meters square in the world a unique 3-word address, meaning that if you were to leave that in a voicemail, you'd make it much easier to be found. Anyway, moving on from that tip, the brother-in-law returned to the hut about 4 hours later at 11:30 AM, and he wasn't worried initially when David wasn't there, as the pair hadn't agreed a time to meet, which was the second mistake. At around 4:30 PM, the brother-in-law tried to ping David over the radio across multiple channels, but there was no response. While he was becoming more uneasy at this point, the pair had planned to collect firewood before the evening. So he set out to do that in the hopes that he might be able to contact David, who he thought was probably just out doing this already. Now, upon nightfall is where the panic really set in, as he still hadn't heard a word from David. At this point, he took a bright torch along the trail that he would have expected to have reconnected with David if David had followed the route properly. He shone the torch into the bushland and made more attempts at contacting David, but there was radio silence, quite literally. The radio was now turned onto scan mode, and he requested that if David can't respond over the radio, he should make another attempt at making his presence known, such as using his hunting gear directly up into the air. This never happened though, and the brother-in-law never heard anything that would reveal David's location. At this stage, he rushed back to the hut and reported David as missing at 8:45 PM that night. Police arrived at 9:45 PM in conditions they described as atrocious, with it being cold, raining heavily and very windy. Snow was forecast for the area down to about 800 meters, with that being 300 meters below the elevation of the hut. After meeting with the brother-in-law and an hour of further searching, it was realised the search needed to be escalated. That search would begin at 8:15 AM the following morning, with professional searchers now out scouring the area, while more and more personnel would pour in throughout the day from all over the place. Searchers made it clear immediately that this was not a good place to get lost in, because they noted that the area was incredibly steep and rugged mountainous terrain with rocky cliffs and long steep slopes. The problem though is that David was supposed to be following a trail to his location, and it wasn't at all clear as to why he would venture off this trail into this kind of terrain. The entire area was covered in thick vegetation, and it was stated that the surroundings were impenetrable, which was a particularly interesting description by the searchers, because it raises the question, if these areas were practically impenetrable, what was David doing at the time and why did he enter? David had a means of defending himself at the time, so it's unlikely that he was pushed in that direction by some kind of predator, unless he was completely blindsided. This didn't seem to make much sense though given the circumstances, because there was no evidence of this left behind at all. The Victoria Police Air Wing flew continuously throughout the day. In the following days, deteriorating weather conditions, including fog and snow dumps, impeded both aerial and ground searching. So, it seems that this began to turn into the perfect storm of disastrous events, all happening at the worst time possible, in an area that already provided the search effort with complex issues to overcome. Despite extensive search efforts over a number of days, including searches undertaken by K9 teams, the searchers failed to find any equipment, clothing, food wraps, or footprints belonging to David. The search continued until the 10th of June, when at the end of that day's searching, the decision was made to suspend it. Presumably, this happened because it became increasingly dangerous to search the area, and in all likelihood, given the severity of the conditions described, it was probably deemed as unviable by medical personnel that a person could make it for that length of time in such conditions. Further search operations did occur though later that month, and then again in September, October and November of 2011, with nothing ever being found. No tangible piece of evidence was obtained to suggest that David met with foul play, nor was any physical evidence located to suggest his disappearance was manufactured. Both Sergeant McPherson and Detective Senior Sergeant Iddles believe that David had passed away. They further believe that there was a major medical event or a serious accident that caused him to be incapable of movement or communication whilst hunting. The problem with this conclusion for some though was that it was argued that if such a medical event had taken place, then he should have been found. The case was made that he wouldn't have been able to venture into these impenetrable areas as described by the search leaders, that were well off the beaten path. There were other irregularities too, including accusations of foul play, but as said, ultimately no evidence of this ever surfaced, so let's move on to something else. Two clairvoyants claimed to know where he was, and there began to be supposed sightings of the missing prison boss. One hunter claimed to have seen David 15 miles away on the Zekasper track, a place familiar to David's family. But the snow came in and the search was called off. The search resumed again that year, over nearly 50 square kilometres. Not a trace of him was found. That Christmas, a story appeared in a Melbourne newspaper that stated it was likely that his remains had been eaten by wild dogs, which spread bones over several kilometres. That doesn't seem like a particularly well thought out suggestion though, because if that had happened, where did the clothing go and all of his hunting equipment? None of it was ever found. Because of how puzzling this disappearance was, some began to speculate that David may have faked the whole thing. Some people began saying that they'd seen him and that he was on the run, but these speculations have been investigated and discounted by authorities. The final conclusions of this disappearance is that David was claimed by the forest, which is likely to be the case, but it's unusual that not a shred of evidence, clothing, etc. ever turned up. What do you think? The Sequoia National Park, located in California, attracts over 1 million visitors every year and is home to ancient and some of the largest trees in the world. This area is vast and 97% of the park's land is considered wilderness, so it's no surprise that people have vanished in this place. However, there are some disappearances that managed to baffle searchers who couldn't make sense of the circumstances. This happened to Andrew Thackerson, who was 5 years old at the time, on the 17th of August 1953. On that day, his parents had decided to visit the park with their 3 boys, 9, 7, and obviously the focus of this report, Andrew. In the very first report, there was little information, only that Andrew had disappeared next to the General Sherman tree. For those that don't know, this tree is ancient, having now reached 2,200 years and is the largest tree in the world as measured by volume. It stands at 275 feet tall and 36 feet in diameter. As they were standing next to this tree in awe at the sight, Andrew managed to vanish right under the noses of his parents, and they had absolutely no idea how or what had happened. They were alone at the time, with no one else nearby, and they hadn't heard Andrew shout or anything of that nature. The parents, growing nervous, began to call for Andrew, and the father scouted deep into the trees to retrieve his son, but there was nothing but a deafening silence. Panicking now, the family rushed to report this incident to the authorities and action was taken swiftly. A search team was put together that reached the size of 150 men within 24 hours. And together, they began to sweep the area using a grid search method. Various bloodhound teams were scattered around this area, and despite the parents providing Andrew's clothing to them, the dogs weren't able to find a scent, and as far as I can tell, they were in the forest areas overnight. Now, despite that, I do just want to say that this incident thankfully did have a happy ending. However, Andrew managed to confuse everyone involved. Searchers today found Andrew sleeping peacefully, unharmed and well on a mountain trail in Sequoia National Park, where he had been missing since yesterday morning. Temporary Ranger Carl Kronberg headed the search party of 20 persons who came across Andrew in the Panther Meadow region. He was 3 miles from the spot where he wandered away from his parents. Kronberg found Andrew lying face down on the trail, sleeping. He was checked at a hospital and found to be in good shape, despite spending a night in the forest where temperatures may drop to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Some outlets reported that this distance that he was found was actually 6 miles, and there seems to be an even number reporting the 2 figures, so it's not completely clear which is the case. However, that distance wasn't the most surprising fact. Despite Andrew being found within 24 hours, this was a difficult search to undertake because the area was still mountainous. It was said to be very rugged and had steep areas all over the place. Despite that, Carl estimated that Andrew had been walking aimlessly for around 12 miles, and other searchers estimated an even higher figure than that, with some saying up to 18 miles. That is staggering and simply unbelievable to think that a 5-year-old could walk that far in an area like this in 24 hours. That doesn't make sense to me, nor did it make sense to some of the searchers, and it seems to me that most adults are going to struggle with a feat like this, especially when you consider the terrain. There were searchers involved that knew that this was odd and felt that there must have been more information to know. But because Andrew was found, there wasn't much discussion on it in the press, past the surprise and confusion shown by the searchers. Though I'm sure between themselves they discussed all kinds of scenarios. But it just seems that when a person is found, that's the end of it and no further conversations take place. Andrew never gave a statement to the press, which was probably a good decision for the parents to have made, because you don't want him to dwell on the experience, because these kinds of events can cause a lot of trauma if you're not careful, especially for someone so young. I'm sure his parents did have a lot of questions for him though. I'm also not even sure how much of this he'd actually remember, given that he was out of it and dazed upon being found. There was probably a lot of shock going on there. These discussions may have been important though, because the distance travelled in the end could indicate that he wasn't alone. Though despite the surprising distance, there wasn't anything else in the way of evidence to support either being moved by another person or an animal. And also, if it was an animal, you probably wouldn't have expected him to have been found, at least safe. Thankfully, Andrew was found and in good condition, but it certainly seems that some of the searchers wanted to know more about this and what had happened. What are your thoughts here? Bruce Diggle, an 82-year-old man from the UK, went missing on the 19th of July while hiking with a group of 8 or 9 people in a rural area of Cyprus, near the village of Stirling. Bruce was described as being somewhat frail and vulnerable by the people he was with, but he left the group of his own accord at around 5:25 PM and then vanished. Specifically, the group had walked around half a mile before Bruce said that he felt a bit uncomfortable. I'm not sure if he meant that the hike had taken its toll or if he felt unwell, but whatever the case may be, he decided that he wasn't going to be able to finish the hike and began to head back to where the cars were parked, alone. This trip was around half a mile back on a tarmac road, and when the rest of the hikers finally arrived back at the cars, panic set in and they reported Bruce missing. Now, before we go any further, I just want to note here that this disappearance was particularly difficult to report on and to collate the information for, because almost all of the articles on Bruce just simply don't exist anymore, and I'm not really sure why. This made it particularly difficult to pinpoint precise locations. In any case, an enormous search and rescue operation was launched immediately, involving many volunteers, various professional search organisations and military personnel, including the authorities from the UK. The British military forces in Cyprus also provided over 20 soldiers to assist the local police in the search, but unfortunately, no clues were found. Despite the efforts of the ground teams and the use of a helicopter with thermal imaging equipment, Bruce could not be located. This was bizarre because military leaders stated that it was only a matter of time before they'd find him. Presumably because of various factors including his age, how he was feeling at the time, etc. That all pointed to the notion that he couldn't get too far away. They assumed that he'd walked a short distance and then sat down to rest, and to that end they had helicopters up in the air patrolling the road. When that failed to spot him, drone teams came up and made an aerial search of the road, which also failed. After 5 days of these efforts went by, the search leaders were said to be baffled that they hadn't managed to find him or even a trace of him. The search began to spread out further and further away from the road he was supposed to travel on, but nothing was working. And after the 7th day, with no leads at all, the search was called off. This disappearance left Bruce's family, friends, and the authorities with many questions. How could, as described, a frail 82-year-old man disappear without a trace in a rural area of Cyprus? Why did the massive search effort provide no results? The idea that Bruce had travelled a significant distance did not seem likely given the situation. As far as I can tell also, Bruce's trip back should have been completely on a clearly visible road. Did he deviate? If so, why? Now, 5 months later, on the 1st of November 2020, hunters found the skeletal remains of a man in an area described as inaccessible near Espikopi. From what I can ascertain with the information still available, this wasn't too far from Bruce's last known location. According to some reports, the remains were found in a sitting position under a bridge, and police immediately suspected that it was Bruce. A week later, DNA tests confirmed that to be correct. The discovery of Bruce's remains raised more questions than answers. How did he end up in an inaccessible area under a bridge? Why did it take 5 months for his remains to be found if it was so close to his last known position? The authorities had absolutely no idea how Bruce even got there. To further confuse this, there was a lot of rubble and debris beneath the bridge, so they also had no idea how he'd managed to climb up over it all. Perhaps Bruce may have experienced some kind of medical event which completely disoriented him. But even still, we face the same question as to how he accessed what was supposed to be an inaccessible area. It's possible that Bruce became disoriented and lost in the forestry, leading him to take shelter from the heat under the bridge where he ultimately passed away. But that does not explain why he deviated from the road into an inaccessible area, which by the very definition of that term, it sounds like he shouldn't have been able to. The assumption, ultimately, was that he couldn't have strayed too far from the road. The circumstances surrounding Bruce's disappearance aren't fully understood at all, but this incident does highlight a very important lesson on planning ahead for potential unseen circumstances, and having a partner when exploring remote and rural areas, especially so if someone elderly is present. It seems to me that if Bruce hadn't gone back alone, whatever happened on this hike back could have been completely avoided. It's a shame that no one seems to have had the sense to escort him back to the car, given that as far as I can tell, the people he was with themselves described him as being frail and vulnerable. It seems at this point that the disappearance will never be fully understood now. This was one of those disappearances that was frustrating to report on because it seems like it could have been completely prevented. There isn't too much more that I can add to this, but I did find this quote by Bruce's daughter that I'll share before we move on. To add a more bizarre coincidence, I was in the country to meet with the police and consulate when my dad was found. Since then, having posed many questions to the police and also maps with our thoughts on his disappearance. Not all paths were followed, quite literally, as he was found only approximately 2.5 miles. I assume that Isabel means that he was found 2.5 miles away from the point he was last seen. I'm glad at the very least that Isabel and her family were able to have some closure on the incident with Bruce being found all that time after, but I'm also not sure how much that helps given that everything seems so bizarre in this case. There really doesn't seem to be many questions that ended up being answered here. What do you think? Thomas A. Murch was an American geologist and planetary scientist. He was a professor at Brown University in Rhode Island, and he was in that position from 1960 up until his disappearance in 1980. Thomas had actually led a very interesting and adventurous life, from being an active member of mountaineering clubs, followed by a stint in the South Korean military as an artillery officer. After this, he came back to the States where he acquired his PhD in geology. More specifically though, Thomas disappeared on the 6th of October 1980 while descending from Mount Nun. According to AmericanAlpineClub.org, Thomas passed away on October 6, 1980 at the age of 49 while descending from the summit of Mount Nun in northern India, following a bivouac above 21,000 feet with 2 former students on an expedition which he initiated and led. He was last seen on the morning of the 6th on a precarious ledge at the bivouac site above the steep northwest face of the mountain after a fall the previous day and the loss of a crampon needed to continue the descent. When one of his 2 companions, Tom Binnett, returned that evening with a spare crampon, Thomas was gone and only his ice axe remained. So, from what I can gather here, the team, or at least Thomas while descending, had a fall the prior day on the 5th, which left him stuck on a precarious ledge. Though, because of the fall, he lost one of his crampons, which meant that he couldn't make it down the rest of the way to his teammates. Presumably, Thomas's two companions tried to help the situation, but eventually Tim had to go retrieve another crampon because Thomas had no way of getting down with only one. When Tim returned on the evening of the 6th, Thomas was missing and only his axe remained on the ledge. I'm sure that there are lots of complexities here that we can't fully appreciate from that description. What was the second companion doing during this time? Clearly he didn't stay with Thomas, so did he accompany Tim? That's not clear in the slightest. But again, we probably have to assume that there are complexities here that we can't fully understand. Reports seem to conflict and get weird at this stage, so let's have a look at some official press reports. 5 days after Thomas disappeared, the Dover Times reporter stated this: according to reports received here today from the climbers' base camp 370 miles to the north, Thomas Mudge, leader of a 7-member American expedition scaling the 23,000-foot Mount Nun in the Himalayas, passed away while making an assault on the summit. Mudge's body was brought to the town of Kargil from the base camp at Tangui. Following his passing on Tuesday, the United News of India reported. The domestic news agency gave no details of his passing, and his hometown in the United States was not immediately known. So we immediately have our first discrepancy. The American Alpine Club make no mention of Thomas ever being found, only that he had disappeared and that his ice axe was the only thing to remain. American press reports at the time of disappearance were mostly stating that his body was recovered and sent to Kargil. It's worthy of mention that newspapers in the US were reporting the same text basically word for word on the 11th and 12th. On October the 13th, Panama City News Herald brought some more information about Thomas to light. I quote, Thomas Mudge, an associated administrator of the US space program NASA, has passed away while leading a 7-member American expedition scaling the 23,000-foot Mount Nun in the Himalayas. The cause of his passing has not been disclosed. The article then repeats that Thomas's body was taken to Kargil, and all press reports are basically the same word for word on the 13th and 14th. On the 15th, press reports are still the same, only adding that details surrounding his passing are not known at this time. After some further digging, I found something absolutely weird, so let's get bizarre. I think it's probably best if I just read this press report out to you. On the 28th of October 1983, the Galveston Daily News reported this. New Delhi, India. 2 Polish climbers found the frozen body of an American climber who disappeared 3 years ago near the summit of a Himalayan peak, the Indian Mountaineering Foundation said Thursday. Thomas Mudge, 49, suffered a head injury while climbing the 23,000-foot Nun Peak in India's Lak region. He vanished after his 2 companions went down to seek help. The foundation reported that the Polish climbers Boylan Agres and Pilak Jerzy found Mudge's body about 660 feet from the summit. His rucksack was still strapped to his shoulders, the climbers said. The 2 were unable to bring Mudge's body down from the mountain, but took several photographs to identify the victim and the location. Mudge, a Brown University geology professor who was on leave to work for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was descending the mountain on October the 5th when he fell into a crevice. 2 companions pulled him free, but he was unconscious and they left him in a makeshift shelter to go for help. When they returned, Mudge was gone and they theorized that he had regained consciousness, tried to climb down and fell a second time. What? What was happening with the press reports the 3 years prior who were stating that Thomas's body had been taken to Kargil? Was that simply not true, and if so, why in the world was that being lied about? Or had they found a body that they believed to belong to Thomas but wasn't actually him? This quite literally cannot be any other kind of mistake, because the difference between having a body and transporting it and not having a body at all is perhaps among the most easily distinguishable things that can ever happen. Reports never indicate what kind of search was organised for Thomas, but I think that we have to assume that there was some sort of effort, given that the authorities knew about it and it was being reported on by the press. This news report also makes it clear that the second companion also joined Tim in retrieving help. Given that Tim returned the same evening with a spare crampon, that could mean that the second companion made his way to civilization to notify the authorities and to get help. When Tim came back, Thomas was no longer there, and the only thing remaining was his ice axe, so where did he go? Again, I think we have to assume that there was some sort of search effort, which presumably would have been localised beneath the ledge that he was on. The question is, was he actually found then and there and transported to Cargill? Or was he missing for the next 3 years until his frozen remains were found by the Polish climbers? And if that is the case, then how did that even happen? And why was false information being reported? I actually find myself siding with the Galveston Daily News report because they cite the Indian Mountaineering Foundation who reported the discovery of the find. And I just don't see what motivation they could have had to report and lie about finding a missing person. The paper trail goes cold here as far as I can tell. What in the world happened to Thomas Mudge? Did he simply fall that day for a second time off the ledge? And if so, why couldn't he be located after that? Or was he located and transported to Cargill? Or was he literally missing for 3 years after that? Good actual lord, you're gonna have to leave your thoughts about this one. What even happened here? As I was exploring various disappearances, I stumbled upon a series of strange cases that occurred in Texas back in 2012. The circumstances surrounding these incidents take an eerie turn as the details unravel. What makes this even more puzzling is that despite extensive investigations, none of these cases have been explained, and they all transpired within a relatively short distance and time frame of one another. It's disconcerting to think that individuals can vanish without a trace, leaving behind a void that seems impossible to fill or even understand. In this particular scenario, the vanishing of several people in such a small time frame raises a lot of red flags. It's quite alarming how the events unfolded, and it's even more concerning that there's still no explanation as to what happened to these individuals. For 3 families waiting for answers, the forbidding woods and bogs of North Liberty County seem to have swallowed their fathers last year without leaving a trace. How can people be swallowed whole and never be seen again like this? "This is crazy," said Kimberly Rogers, whose father, Dennis, was the last of the 3 men to disappear nearly 10 months ago. Before we explore Dennis's disappearance, let's go back to the beginning. The first to vanish under bizarre circumstances was 62-year-old and disabled trucker Edwin Rogers. Edwin lived in Liberty County, and while there isn't much information published about Edwin specifically, I believe that he was a veteran, and on the day in question, which was the 30th of December 2011, he'd spoke to his brother and asked if he'd like to accompany him to the town's Veterans Hall. His brother seems to have been busy that day and declined, which only in hindsight would that be very unfortunate, and perhaps this whole incident could have been avoided in other circumstances. This conversation between the brothers though would be the last time anyone ever heard or saw Edwin again. The following day, on the 31st, right before the new year, Edwin's wife and stepson both saw his green Jeep on the side of Texas 213 near County Road 2243 between Cleveland and Tarkenton Prairie. The pair went to investigate the vehicle. His cellular phone and medication was still inside the vehicle. Multiple searches have been conducted by the Liberty County Sheriff's Office and EquiSearch, to include air and ground searches. Unfortunately, even with all of the resources expended thus far, Edwin remains missing. What's particularly of interest here is the fact that Edwin was considered disabled and had bad legs, so he wasn't able to walk very far. So the immediate question would be, if that's the case, why was he nowhere to be found in the general vicinity? If it's not a realistic proposal to suggest that he walked well out of the area, what went down that day? People seem to be surprised at this and weren't sure how he could have left the area on foot. This search for Edwin was fairly extensive in scope and, as said, had ground and air elements alongside dogs who never picked up his scent. Investigators are still searching for clues in the case of missing Tarkington resident Edwin Rogers. Investigators arranged for members of Texas EquiSearch to help pursue a place of interest on foot Friday morning, but nothing was found. Evans said this area of interest was a patch of disturbed ground that was searched with ground-penetrating radar, proved unfruitful. Needless to say, but this didn't work, and a further search of the area didn't uncover anything either. Many years later, in 2018, some bones were found in a wooded area in the general vicinity, but they didn't belong to Edwin. And ultimately, no signs have ever been discovered over 10 years later now from the initial disappearance. The second person to vanish under unusual circumstances was Mark Reinberger, who disappeared around a month and a half after Edwin, whose disappearance still continues to baffle investigators. On the day of Mark's disappearance, the 15th of February 2012, also just happened to be his birthday. Mark was a welder who lived in Crosby, and apparently he'd been displaying unusual behaviour during the build-up to this event. At 5 AM that morning, Mark got up, left his home, and got in his 2005 white Chevrolet truck, where he then set off. His daughter, Amanda, would later state that Mark rushed from his home, leaving his wallet behind. Over the course of the next couple of hours, Mark drove to 2 gas stations and told attendants that he believed that he was being stalked and pursued by someone, but he didn't or wasn't able to extrapolate on this at all. He didn't make it known why he felt this way or what he'd observed to come to that conclusion. In any case, 2 hours after rushing from his home and reaching the gas stations, at 7 AM, his car collided with a dilapidated house near the Trinity River Bridge. People were on the scene quickly to check on the driver, but upon inspection, there was no one in the car and Mark had vanished. The key was still in the ignition, and there were no clear signs to indicate what might have happened to him, but it sure appears suspicious and just odd that moments before he felt that another presence was watching him. Who this may have been, or just what was going on at that time, will likely never be understood now. The people rushed to the scene, then called the sheriff to explain what had just happened. And he and his deputies arrived and began searching the perimeter, which included the forest areas too. They found no trace of him that day, and Mark hadn't left any indications on the ground of which direction he took. Over the course of a few weeks, the investigation grew in size and volunteers were out looking for him, alongside other people who were just being mindful and keeping an eye out as they travelled the area. The investigation continued for weeks after this, but in all that time there were no discoveries whatsoever. That was until the 6th week. 6 weeks later, Mark's jacket with his cell phone in the pocket was found a few miles away near a remote gravel pit, authorities said. This gave the authorities a new focus point, and this quarry area was searched, but nothing else was ever uncovered, and the findings never led to Mark, and how his items even got there was never explained. I'm sure that you can imagine in a case like this, but rumours began to run wild. Investigators also tracked down rumours overheard at a bar and posted on Facebook that Mark had been taken on a ride from which he would never return, but could never substantiate them. It's hard to even know what to think about that. After investigations, it looks like the authorities didn't seem to think that there was anything to that other than pure rumours and people speculating. This lack of leads led many to state that they believed that there was an element of foul play involved, while others have suggested that he may have staged his own disappearance. I can certainly see why people would conclude that there may have been foul play. Mark felt that he was being followed, and then to hear rumours like that. The authorities did question some people in the area and had a confrontation with 3 people in a trailer, but ultimately it didn't lead anywhere, and it seems that the authorities couldn't find any evidence that suggested that they had any involvement. His family seemed to believe that Mark was fleeing someone that day. Now, 21 days after Mark disappeared, a man by the name of Dennis Rogers, unrelated to Edwin Rogers, disappeared 9 miles away on the 8th of March 2012. Dennis was an electrician for Shell Oil, but sadly had experienced a serious medical event 5 years prior that left him with short-term memory loss, and at times made him somewhat confused and disoriented. As a result of this, he was in constant contact with his daughter, Crystal, who was always there for her father. The pair would call each other frequently throughout the day, as Crystal liked to make sure that he was okay, and usually this seemed to be the case. Despite Dennis's medical event those years prior, as far as I can tell, it seems that he was able to maintain a fairly high level of autonomy, and he would take frequent walks outdoors near his home and near the woods which were close by too. This time though would be different. On Thursday, Dennis entered the woods in the area. Once in the woods, which was close to 3:30 PM, he became lost. When his daughter called him on his cell phone is when it was determined he was no longer on his daily walk but actually lost in the woods. Crystal obviously became highly concerned during this phone call, and Dennis told her that he was in the middle of pine trees and on a trail. Crystal got in her vehicle and drove down to the wooded area that she believed he may have been and began sounding the horn of her car, but there was no response from Dennis. Dennis's family then rushed to local law enforcement so they could use their phone to help locate him, and weirdly, they did get a ping on the phone, and they began to move in on the specified location, which was now in the middle of thousands of acres of the wooded area. When they reached this location, they couldn't find Dennis anywhere. Friday afternoon, a bloodhound with Precinct 4 was put on the ground at Mr. Rogers' home. Oliver picked up a track and led deputies deep into the woods before he lost it. Friday night, Texas Department tracking dogs were put on the ground at the same location, but they too lost the trail. It's interesting that the dogs were able to pick up the scent initially before losing it. Now, at this point, and rather suddenly, the weather started to take a turn for the worse and temperatures began to drop. The harsh downpour of rain completely prevented air support from going up, and four-wheelers now began to get stuck in the forest. The conditions present also began to affect phone signals, which meant that they now had an even more difficult time trying to ping Dennis's phone. His last known position was thought to have been in a very dense forested area near a large swamp, and despite the conditions, it was said that there were over 150 people out in the forest desperately trying to reach him. The problem was, despite the pings, they just couldn't find him at all. Let's hear a little more about this. Dennis initially didn't want to call police as he thought this might land him in a retirement home or something similar. His former wife finally convinced him to call the police close to 8:30 PM. She then had to go to the police department to physically be there for them to ping his phone to locate it. She arrived and found the officer that could do it had just been dispatched on a call and once again had to wait for his return. When he was reached on the phone, he was not in a panic. He just told the dispatchers he had become lost. From 8:30 PM until a few minutes after 1 AM, they were able to get locates on his phone. Then it stopped. Officials feel that the battery ran out. The last two pings were within a very short distance from each other, and all but one was along a roadway used by hunters and loggers. The United States Coast Guard was called in an attempt to locate him using thermal imagery, but they were unsuccessful in almost an hour that they were there. They were forced to leave the area due to rains moving in and low fuel levels. At 4 AM that morning, Dennis's footprints were found near his last known ping location, but they led nowhere before disappearing. This disappearance was absolutely baffling to everyone involved, and it must have been so frustrating to have his location, find the footprints, but then he's just nowhere to be found. Then the weather gets worse quickly and they have to pause. Because of how bizarre things were looking, rumours began to spread about foul play, and the authorities again investigated these rumours, but as far as I can tell, No one was arrested, so I can only assume there was no evidence of this present. About a year on, again, bones were found in this general area, but they didn't belong to Dennis. Liberty County Sheriff spokesman Captain Rex Evans said they are investigating the cases but haven't found anything to indicate that they're connected. Nevertheless, it has fueled paranoia in this remote area about 90 minutes northeast of Houston, in many parts impenetrable by thick forest. It's difficult to know what to make of all that. It's very odd to have 3 people go missing and never be found in such a short time span and distance from one another. It's also odd that rumours and suspicions of foul play kept cropping up, of which there was never any actionable evidence for it, it seems. That was basically all of the information that I could find for these events, and as said, they all remain unexplained and without any real conclusions. Now, at this point, this next disappearance is not connected in any way to the previous 3, and also occurred many years prior, but it's still interesting and also worth sharing in this video. That being the strange case of Dr. Robert North, a 35-year-old physician who went missing in Big Bend National Park in 1947. Dr. North was a brilliant individual who had earned his Doctor of Medicine degree in Michigan and enjoyed a successful career as a physician for many years. However, in 1946, he began experiencing health issues and decided to leave medicine behind to pursue his passion for photography. Perhaps he believed that this career shift would help manage the stress that might have exacerbated his heart condition. Dr. North visited the national park on the 5th of June that year for a well-needed rest after suffering from a heart attack just 3 days prior. Thankfully, it wasn't a major attack, but no heart attack is good news, and he took this as a warning sign that he needed to begin reducing stress in his life. 2 days later, on the 7th, would be the last time that he would ever be seen again. And this was near the cabin he'd rented within the park, roughly 70 miles south of Marathon. His disappearance was not reported until June 14, when his cabin, containing over $600, over $8,000 today in camera equipment, as well as other articles, was discovered abandoned. He was last seen when he left his cabin on June 7 to buy food for his boxer dog, Tuffy. It's not completely clear to me who reported him missing, as he was at the rest camp alone with Tuffy, while his wife and family remained in Monaghan's. Perhaps when his family hadn't heard from him, they went to look for him, but it wasn't mentioned. In any case, it seems that the searchers believed that they would find him relatively quickly, or at the very least a sign of him, Tuffy, or his car that he drove on the 7th. This wasn't the case though, despite having several experienced Texan pilots in the air and many boots on the ground, including bloodhounds. They found no evidence of his presence anywhere, and the dogs never found a scent to indicate a direction of travel. At this stage, authorities shared more details about Robert's last known position. Later, on the 7th, Robert showed up at Lupe's store below Terlingua, and some distance from park headquarters, where he asked about dog food. The next day, officers found after investigation he registered at Balmoria State Park, about 55 miles north of Alpine. The press went quiet for a time before stating on the 28th of July that Robert had been missing for 7 weeks now, and still no clues had been unearthed at all. Of course, the official search had long since come to a close at this point, but local ranchers still made efforts to search while they were working their land. Now, I thought that was the end of the paper trail, but I was wrong. In September of 1951, something unexpected happened. Mystery surrounding the disappearance of Dr. Robert North 4 years ago deepened today with a physician's report that bones found near the missing man's abandoned car were animal bones. A car found in Big Bend National Park Canyon last week had been identified as the car Dr. North was driving when he disappeared. Many found it odd that the car hadn't been spotted sooner during the initial searches, which led to questions and speculations of foul play. The insinuation being that the car may have been moved afterwards, though there was no real evidence of this. Secondly, initially people thought that the bones found belonged to Tuffy, but later this was also realised to not be the case. The bones were definitely not human, said Mrs. North. Since his disappearance, his wife has continuously tried to learn exactly what happened to her husband. A ground party found that the North car, identified from papers locked in the glove compartment, was 200 yards off of the Arroyo Road. The key was in the switch, turned off. Based off this information, authorities came to the conclusion that in all likelihood, Robert had planned to return to the car promptly, but obviously this never happened. Park rangers were also placed on the scene to help figure out exactly what went on that day, and they began to search all of the possible routes leading from the abandoned car, but there was no indication of Robert's presence on any of the trails. Park Superintendent Ross G. Maxwell said a complete search of the area is being made. A final examination of Dr. North's car showed he had spent considerable time trying to extricate his car from the bed of the arroyo. The front of the car had apparently been stopped by a large boulder, and a flat rock had been placed in front of the left wheel to elevate it over the boulder. Skid chains had been used and apparently slipped off. It was further apparent that Dr. North expected to return to the car in a short time because he left the keys in the ignition switch. It is also believed that he gave up trying to extricate the car when the rear tyre blew out. So, clearly Robert was having problems that day and managed to get his car stuck. It's not clear at all why he left the vicinity of the car or what he was doing in the meantime. As said, the keys were still in the ignition, and this led the authorities and rangers alike in agreement that this probably meant that Robert fully intended to return to the car to have another go at getting it free. Interestingly, they weren't able to identify the bones around the car and so sent them to the FBI to be analysed. Nothing more was ever said about this, other than Dr. Ross Maxwell, the superintendent, stating, "The bones are those of a beast." This was never expanded upon, except for confirming that they weren't Tuffy's. You might think that this would have been nice to know, but they just never said anything else about the bones after that. At this point also, Mrs. North began to grow dismayed at the whole ordeal and didn't understand how the car could have gone unnoticed for all this time, making the point that it should have been found initially. She then went on to accuse the park of failing to search thoroughly. It's understandable why she was feeling this way, and an explanation as to how the car was missed during the initial ground and aerial searches was never offered. The authorities kept repeating the line that there was no evidence of foul play, but I have to wonder if that's the way Mrs. North was leaning with her suspicions. She certainly thought that this whole incident seemed unusual or off somehow. She kept filing requests for the FBI to conduct a serious investigation into the whole incident themselves, but this never came to fruition. Ultimately, despite continued searching of the area for weeks after the car was discovered, nothing else was ever found. No clothing, no remains, nothing. None of the questions were ever answered, and it's not known what happened to Dr. North or his dog. That also, as far as I can tell, is the end of the paper trail, and I wasn't able to find anything else. What do you think happened? This final case I want to cover is of a disappearance I relayed over 4 years ago now, but I've revoiced it to bring it up to date. It's absolutely bizarre and certainly worth sharing again. In the early part of the 18th century, Owen Parfitt, along with his family, lived in a small town in the west of England known as Shepton Mallet. Shepton Mallet is a civil parish in the Mendip district of Somerset with a population today of approximately 10,000 people, though that will have been far fewer over 250 years ago. It's unclear how many siblings Owen actually had, but it's understood that he did have one older sister named Mary who was 15 years older. During his younger years, Owen was apprenticed by his father and put to work as a tailor. It was stated that he learned this trade well, but hated sewing day in and day out. Owen grew tired of this and eventually enrolled as a soldier, For many years after enlisting, Owen was somewhat forgotten. His parents had passed away at this point, and all that was left was Mary. Sometimes she would receive reports stating where in the world he was on active duty, but by and large she often had no idea where her younger brother was. Eventually, Owen did return to Mary, though many years had passed and he wasn't in such great shape anymore and suffered harshly from rheumatism. He did say that he loved his time serving, but it was clear that this time spent had taken its toll. While Owen was still able-bodied in the sense that he could still walk, his movements were very slow and he couldn't do it for long. His plan was to get back into tailoring to help support himself and Mary, who were now back living together. The house was just off the main street where the garden connected to it. This was quite a rural home at the time, and it was completely surrounded by forestry and fields for miles in every direction. There was a nice small community in the area, and Owen would often sit in the garden and talk with some friends who he'd met in the area. However, over time, Owen's rheumatism only got worse and worse, and in the end, he couldn't walk or even move much without help. In the end, and for years, he could barely even move his hands, never mind his legs, which makes his disappearance just that much stranger. As said, Owen was 65 years old and Mary was now 80, so she was quite a bit older. But she did care for Owen, however she had gotten much weaker and struggled to move him by herself. So, on the afternoon of a June day in 1768, Mary asked one of her neighbours by the name of Susanna Snook, who lived no more than 50 yards away, to come and help her, and together they managed to take Owen to his usual chair in the garden. Owen always wore comfortable night clothing at this point and always had his coat with him in the garden. After Susanna made Owen comfortable, she went back inside to Mary and then left for her home through the back door. Now, this is where things get bizarre. Mary had planned to sit with Owen outside in the garden, but first wanted to tidy the cottage. This took her approximately 30 minutes, and when she went outside to join Owen, he wasn't there. She looked around briefly, but he was nowhere to be seen. She then went to retrieve Susanna, who was left dumbfounded and had no idea where he could have gone. This was a man who could barely move, and yet somehow the garden seat was empty and Owen was nowhere to be seen. To make matters even stranger was the fact that the nearby fields surrounding the cottage were full of people as it was the haymaking season, and yet no one had seen anything. Mary was said to be distraught, and Susanna had another look round and asked Mary if she'd heard anything, but she hadn't. Susanna also detailed that the chair was left in the same position that she'd left it. The pair raised the alarm, and the neighbours, alongside those working in the fields, got together and made a thorough sweep of the area. This included around the cottage, the fields, the nearby forestry and the town, but there was no sign of him. This was regarded as highly unusual given his condition and the fact that he really shouldn't have been able to get very far. In addition to this, nearby ponds, wells and ditches were scoured, along with outhouses, but these searches didn't find a single trace as to where Owen had gone. Here's a quote from the author, Mrs. Lang, who wrote about this disappearance in her book titled The Strange Storybook. "Why would anyone wish to hide a harmless, old disabled man in any of these places? It didn't make sense. Nobody stopped to ask how this could have been done in broad daylight. But in spite of the thorough nature of the hunt, which did not cease even during a sharp thunderstorm, and went on all that night and the next day, then, nor later, was any trace ever found of Owen Parfitt." This is an old publication that dated back to 1912 and was the oldest piece of documentation that I could find in regards to Owen. Many people who take an interest in these kinds of disappearances cite bad weather conditions hitting the area when a case like this takes place, so perhaps that might be of note to some. In any case, a Dr. Butler, who would be the future Bishop of Lichfield, took a particular interest in this disappearance, though it isn't clear why. Dr. Butler led the investigation as to what may have happened but unlike today's times, things were not documented so thoroughly. Dr. Butler first questioned as to whether Owen had been taken by someone, but conceded that it was very unusual that nothing was heard. He also detailed that if that was the case, then the many people in the fields should have seen or heard something. He also inquired as to whether Owen was actually as disabled as everyone thought he was, or whether he simply disappeared intentionally. However, this was disputed pretty much immediately, with locals telling him that he hadn't been seen on his feet in years. Bizarrely, there was a rumour that a person who fit Owen's description had been wandering near a town roughly 12 miles away in a field, but that was deemed as impossible to be Owen. Some bones were eventually found near the area in 1814, but they was discovered as belonging to a female who had passed years prior. Interestingly, the locals attributed Owen's disappearance with something evil, stating that they believed that he'd been taken by this force. To this day, no one knows what happened to Owen or where he went. Dr. Butler said that he gave up and stated that it was an impossible riddle. To quote many articles on this disappearance, Owen seems to have disappeared into thin air. With that, I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around and disappearing on the screen. If you found the video interesting, then please do leave a like, hit the bell and subscribe if you haven't already. If not, then feel free to leave a dislike. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, peace.